Mr Farage now.
Yes, thank you. I think they're just slightly over-enthusiastic. Well, it wasn't supposed to be like this, was it? Because Mr Cameron's renegotiation began with really big intentions. Treaty change. He was going to question blue cards going up already. This is going to be fun. He was going to control the free movement of people. He was going to achieve a fundamental change, not just in Britain's relationship with the European Union, but reform the EU itself. And what we got was a letter from Mr Tusk, in which there's no treaty change, no powers returned to the United Kingdom, and no control over our borders at all. In fact, it was hardly worth the wait. It's really rather pathetic. But there is, of course, one more chance for the Prime Minister, because he goes to the European Summit in a couple of weeks' time, and like Oliver Twist, he will parade in front of the other leaders and say, please can we have some more concessions. I find it rather humiliating that a British Prime Minister has to do this, but I'm certain of one thing: he won't get another thing. Because just look at the substance of this. We have an emergency brake on migrant benefits. Wow! It was supposed to be a total ban on migrant benefits for up to 4 years. So it is hardly an emergency brake, it's more of a handbrake turn. And the Prime Minister is saying we've got a red card. Isn't that wonderful? Well, what that means is, if a majority of parliaments in the European Union can say to Mr Juncker they don't want one of his directives, is that a cause for celebration? I mean, if 15 parliaments couldn't stop a piece of law, we'd be living in a communist dictatorship. And what I've gone through here are the good bits. But the most bizarre thing is Mr Cameron said with this deal he would now vote for Britain to join the European Union. So let's have a little think about that. If the question in June was should we join the European Union, we'd have to tell the British people you must surrender the control and sovereignty of your parliament and have 75% of your laws made somewhere else. Your Supreme Court will not be supreme. You will be overruled by a court in Luxembourg made up of people who aren't even judges. You will have to give up your fishing grounds, including, in some places, 200 miles of the North Sea, and you must cut your links with the Commonwealth and the wider world because you're no longer fit to negotiate your own global trade deals. Oh, and by the way, for all of this, you'll be paying £55 million a day as a membership fee. Would the British people vote for that? Not a snowball's chance in Hades. And all we have to do is recognise that whilst the politicians and the big banks and the big businesses will in this referendum defend their own vested self-interests, it's people power that will win this referendum, and after we've won this referendum, I hope in many other countries in Europe too.
Yeah.
Colleague Scott CATO has a question for you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to have the opportunity to say that as a British member here, I'm embarrassed and ashamed by the rude and disrespectful behaviour by the UKIP members here. And I would like to ask Mr Farage if during the forthcoming campaign he will do anything to control the behaviour of his members.
One moment, please. Now, one of the basic rules of democracy is that you listen before responding. So, please, listen to what the individual has to say before commenting.
Seconds. I want to say that I'm embarrassed and ashamed by the behaviour of UKIP members here today and their disrespect for other members, which ironically I find to be extremely un-British. I would like to ask Mr Farage whether he is going to attempt to control his members and prevent them from this sort of intimidation both inside the chamber and more widely on social media during this campaign.
I don't know whether you have a television in your house or not, but if you do, you might have watched Prime Minister's questions, and you might have seen that actually in elected assemblies all over the world there is vigorous, lively debate, and there's sometimes even humour too. How about that? The most vociferous members I've known in this Parliament since I've been here are our President, when he led the Socialist Group for many years, and indeed Mr Verhofstadt, who leads the Liberal Group, who very often have shouted or mocked things that I've said, and frankly, as an elected representative, I'm big enough and ugly enough to take it, and so should you be. Yeah.
As the most internationalist and outward-facing party, the Lib Dems are committed to keeping Britain a full member of the EU.
Thank you very much. Well, your intervention has yielded 5 demands for blue cards. I'm going to admit one, and that's Bill Etheridge. Are you prepared to answer it?
No, I think we've had enough blue cards already today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For 1 minute, Janice Atkinson.
Well, it's Cam, Sham and Labour will keep the white flag flying, along with the Greens and the remaining Lib Dem. The British public knows that this was a Chamberlain moment, and so do the British newspapers. Let me read to you what the British media are saying. The Sun, who do you think you're kidding, Mr Cameron? The Daily Mail, footling, pedantic and almost ineffective. The Express, a joke. The Mirror, sophistry and spin. Voters are very well informed and they read newspapers. The media matters. There's nothing on agriculture, fishing, trade and environmental policies. Now it's very clear, there is no change. No treaty change, no repatriation of British sovereignty. Britain will keep paying the billions into the EU. And crucially, our borders will remain open to migrants and terrorists. The truth is, Cameron got pretty much what he asked for. Absolutely nothing. It means nothing, and this is what the British people will do, and go for Brexit.
A minute and a half now for Hans-Olaf Henkel.
President Schulz yesterday said that there would be no extra portions for the UK. Well, let's not deceive ourselves, ladies and gentlemen, because if the UK were to leave the EU would surely but certainly demise. And I think, Mr. Royal and Mr. Weber, I need to say to you, gentlemen, just bear in mind who is the second biggest net contributor to the budget. And finally, the country that understands its people will be leaving this Parliament. So the proposal that Prime Minister Cameron has brought about is not only good for the UK, but good for Europe. Subsidiarity is always better than centralism. And taking responsibility for yourself is always better than taking responsibility for the bank and other debts of everybody else. I think, unfortunately, Mr. Verhofstadt isn't here because in his modest way, he said he was a very positive person, and having characterized one of my people as negative, I would say to him, we need an opt-out from people and policies of the kind of Mr. Verhofstadt.
Herr Kamal.
Mr. Kamal. I have a question for you. Mr. Coburn has asked to put a question to you. But just a second, Mr. Coburn did hold up his blue card before you'd even started speaking. So I'm just wondering, just a second, how can you put a question on a speech that hasn't yet been held? We will no doubt find out.
Dankeschön, mein Präsident. Mr. Kamal, thank you for taking my question. You're always a good sport. Mr. Kamal, if you want a fair British immigration policy, can you have that within the EU?
Well, Mr. Coburn, thank you very much. And I must say, I admire your abilities to predict my speech. I think in future I might actually ask you to write some of the speech. Or actually, when I'm struggling for words, I can ring you up and say, what do you think will be my speech tomorrow? But actually, in this case, you asked a very fair question and something that has to be put to the British people. If you want immigration policy, what you call a fair immigration policy, that everyone outside the UK is treated equally, whether they are from Austria or Australia, Croatia or the Caribbean, Italy or India, you cannot achieve that by remaining in the EU. And that is something, you have to be honest, but you have to put that, you have to make that clear to the British people.
Colleague Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. President. After the flurry of activity yesterday over the Prime Minister's deal, many in my constituency are asking, what was it all about? Having read the draft agreement, we see that the renegotiation of our relationship with the EU amounts to little more than a choreographed talks process, a faux battle, a smoke and mirrors charade that has resulted in little more than the status quo. I'm saddened to say a failure of our Prime Minister to stand up for our United Kingdom. Treaty change, retaking control over our laws, has disappeared, and a promise to return control over our borders has been watered down to a benefit curve that has to be agreed by Brussels. The ever-present issue of the cost of membership has not even been addressed, a cost estimated to rise by a further £3 billion by the Office for Budget Responsibility in 2020. I'm delighted that the democratic process will now take control. I look forward to a frank and honest debate over our relationship with the European Union.